an original.
From Story Studio Network.
Welcome in. Here we go. Thursday, April the 13th. Good of you to join us for Now and Next. Story Studio Network. I'm Dave Trafford. And this is our final offering for Now and Next this week. Tomorrow, we're back with your Ontario Politics podcast on the Ledge. We had a few folks in sick bay the last couple of weeks. John Wright and Sabrina and Angie were down with it. Then we had Good Friday, so we took the day off. By the way, the piece that we did include in that feed last Friday was a re-roll from the 2030 project. Folks at the Daily Bread Food Bank worked on that. And the reason that we use that specific episode is because the food bank last week talked about the dire conditions that they are facing right now. A third of all food bank clients have full-time jobs. A third. So there's a real need now for this reckoning, this recalibration of how we look at social services, etc. And we're going to get into sort of the, I guess, the black and white of it, but also sort of this imbalance that we look at, because on the one hand, the economy seems to be booming. On the other hand, we have such difficulty with folks having to line up for beds at shelters and baskets of food at the food bank. So we dropped the episode that focused on a conversation around guaranteed income from that series. And John Wright was a part of that panel. Sheila Regier at the Basic Income organization, the national group that's advocating for that. And Evelyn Forget is a professor in Winnipeg who specializes in that kind of research. And for those who, I think it's an interesting conversation because for a lot of reasons, we saw that CERB made a difference in people's lives, $2,000 a month. And oddly enough, food bank use actually went down in some communities during the pandemic. And you can draw a line from the CERB to that. But on the other hand, there'll be people who say we can't afford it. Poverty costs us $33 billion a year in Ontario alone, and those are pre-COVID numbers. So I'm not sure how we can afford poverty as opposed to affording to make sure that people have stable housing and all that kind of thing. Anyway, there's lots of that kind of stuff in the pot to make soup on today. So we thought we would invite Lindsay Broadhead in here, and she is a communications specialist, and we knew her from her good work at the Toronto Region Board of Trade. How are you this morning?
I'm wonderful. Thank you. How are you doing?
I'm okay.
It's glorious outside.
It wasn't a beautiful. It's funny. I went to the rink last night, and wore just shirt sleeves and so on. A couple of the guys that were wearing shorts already. Even there, it was warm in the arena. So
yeah, when the ice is melting.
Yeah.
But it's medicine. People are walking around, Dave, with smiles.
Oh,
it's like,
imagine.
What are these people doing?
What's wrong with you people? Yeah.
Yeah, we're not quite at the stage where we're saying good morning to one another, but there's definitely some smiles.
Do you find that though? I used to be, when my knee was feeling better, I'd go out for a morning run, and you'd go by somebody that you may or may not know. I think runners probably do this more than anything just because they're out there, and they'll say good morning to somebody, and it just shocks the look of shock, or if not horror, on someone's face when you say good morning, and out of the blue they don't know what to do.
I love it. It's like when I'm up north with my kids, and I'll wave at, we're going for a walk on a country road or something like that, and you wave at the drivers who are passing by. And my kids look at me like, what are you doing?
Yeah.
Wait, do we know that person? But that's how I was raised, and I like it. There's something very familiar about it.
Now, there's a certain culture. We have a family cottage, and the boats go by, and you're sitting out in the front deck or whatever, and everybody waves. So, I have no idea who you are, but that's just the way of the world. And we could probably use a little bit more of that. I was listening to discussions lately about the mayoral campaign here in Toronto, and at last count, there are 43 names. I guarantee you there'll be 44 because the pressure seems to be on for Olivia Chow to jump in. But Anthony Prudz is the latest profile name, I'll suggest, as a city councillor. And I won't go on the rant again about he should have to step down from his job at council.
Yes, we spoke about that the last time we talked.
Yeah, but I think that's probably one of the things that is going to have to be assessed. When the last time we talked, we did discuss that relationship between Toronto, province, feds. Where is Toronto's place in there, and what kind of muscle can it flex to actually stand up on its own? And that's not to suggest that Toronto doesn't have some issues in terms of how it's running itself, but it's a unique circumstance, especially in terms of how it provides services that other levels of government shouldn't, in fact, are responsible for. But I begin to wonder whether or not part of that conversation is as much about the mechanism of our elections in Toronto. The idea that we're having this mayoral campaign outside of a regular city council campaign, I think is a benefit. It's to some degree because there's that focus is just on who's going to run the mayor's office, and do we do it, in the off years? So 2024 will run for council, 2026 is the mayor's campaign, and these are both 4-year terms. But we've got some continuity in there. Election season then just doesn't become a complete standstill for everything. We've still got somebody at the helm who's running city council or who's running the mayor's office. I think there's probably something to that. And then the whole question as to whether or not councillors should keep their seats if they want to run for another office. I think that would be useful discussion at Queen's Park.
Yeah, I mean, people are always shocked if they are coming in from the States or if they're just not familiar with municipal politics. And I don't pretend to be an expert. It's a sea of confusion, the bureaucracy and complications of municipal politics. But people forget the basics, which is it's, one seat, one vote. So the mayor's vote is that. He or she is an equal. And we don't treat the role like that though at all.
Yeah, exactly.
There's a disproportionate, and rightly so, expectation that the mayor is going to lead, guide, and have a different kind of influence. So then you can talk about the strong mayor powers, et cetera. But I lived in England for a number of years and lived in London, and everyone hated London if you weren't from London, right? And the same thing is here. There's this, you always hear what unites Canada is its common hatred of Toronto, which is, as a Torontonian, I find silly.
Well, they hate us more for dismissing
we're Canadians first. Well, yeah, well, there we go. So I'm adding fuel to their fire, I suppose, in the early morning here. But at a certain point, you just have to be objective about the whole thing. And we've thrown around numbers like this before, but Toronto is 20% of our GDP for the country. You were talking about the Daily Bread Food Bank. I mean, we hold, and it's not just Toronto, it's our urban centers, but we hold a disproportionate amount of responsibility to the people who are here. And that's not only, what I'll call more, urgent front of line situations like providing food and shelter, but it becomes systemic in our hospital systems and all these things. So, right now we're in this really interesting moment where there's a flash flood of crises happening in different sectors, and it's happening for all interwoven reasons. But Toronto really should be able to stand up and have a say, and the province should be able to acknowledge that without there being the same rub that there is with other municipalities. And same goes for Mississauga and other significant municipalities in the province and country, but Toronto certainly is a standout.
The other side of this is, and even it's seeping into the campaign where things are becoming cranky and negative. And a
Yes.
lot of that has to do with some of the fringe characters that are involved here, just throwing up websites and spewing nonsense, if not worse.
Yeah.
And so it's actually one of those things that will drag this thing into the mud, on the one hand. On the other hand, we start to throw stats around. We're looking at the lowest unemployment numbers we've seen in a long time. The jobless rates are good. People are, seem to be doing okay. At the same time, inflation, well, it seems as though it's kind of slowed down a bit. But when you look at other economic indicators, food bank visits being one of them that we really don't pay enough attention to, 270,000 individual visits in Toronto alone in the last month. And that's suggesting that we're going in there's a real divergent path there. And we're creating more of a gap than there was before the pandemic.
Yep.
And I don't know how we bridge those things right now, because they're both such a force of nature that they've kind of taken hold, and they're on track to maintain that trajectory.
Yeah, and I mean, you're bringing up a few things there. There's the kind of the inherent negativity that happens, I guess, in any campaign. Good news doesn't sell. Good news doesn't get voters out to vote, but good ideas do. And this election seems to be doing two things at once. And maybe it's because of the focus you talked about. Maybe it's just because we're in this interesting moment in time, but it's proving to be so far idea heavy, policy heavy, focusing in on ideas that some of them more realistic than others on a financial in a financial sense, but ideas that people can get their heads around. They're not these strange backroom dealy type of policies that no one really listens about. They're things that are tangible. They're about safety. They're about transit. They're about food. And at the same time, there's some broad themes and narratives that are surfacing. It's about Toronto from the past versus Toronto of the future. Who are we? What's our inherent personality? There seems to be discussions around the mayor that we choose should embody who we can be in the international space too, as we deal with trade and all the things that Toronto does. So those are some of the conversations we're having. And then in terms of the negativity on issues and the gap that we're creating, it's fascinating. And The Economist is covering it quite a bit now, and there's a confusion. It's the trends aren't trending to how it could be measured in the past, right? I think I read our inflation is down to about 5.2, 5.3 from where it was at 8.1, I think. So it's trending in the right place. Bank of Canada held yesterday, which is good. But when people were owning homes at 2-3% less than they are now, you can only assume that some of the trends you're talking about, need for help and assistance, are going to increase. That money that folks had and had saved up, or they had help with during COVID, is gone. And even though folks have jobs, the jobs aren't keeping pace, the salaries aren't keeping pace with what we need to sustain ourselves. And that's across the board, right? This isn't just, that's, I think, all levels of wealth. So I would suggest that the next 1 or 2 quarters are going to be very critical and interesting in terms of what we see for trends.
Yeah, and I think that the whole question around the federal government sort of, ignoring Toronto specifically in the budget,
Mm-hmm.
the province didn't really do anything for the city in its budget as well. And we start to look at the shortcomings and the shortfall as far as city services are concerned. The thing that I think happens here, and certainly from the media perspective, is we look at it when the budget comes down and we assume that, the money wasn't there, it must mean there's a hole right now. It's not how it works, all right? I mean, those payments take time to actually work their way through the system. So when we're looking at the shock to the system, there's a it's what do they call them? Delayed indicator,
Like a lagging
a
indicator.
lagging
Yeah.
indicator.
Yeah.
So, where, for example, I keep coming back to the food bank visits are not lagging at all. They're in the moment and they can tell right now. When we look at that pressure, for example, on the homeless shelters, there's something like $317 million that they spend on shelters right now. If they have to start cutting $1 billion to make up the shortfall next year, that's no $317 million total won't go away, but a lot of that will. And so we're going to start to see all of these things begin to intersect. Fewer shelters, more people who are full-time employed needing food banks, if not shelters. This could unravel in a hurry without some real attention and vision.
And you need to start somewhere, right? Like, I think the mind blows suddenly if you're looking at this whole ecosystem and everything is falling apart. I think we need and we'd be smart to focus on a few things. There were good inroads made around housing, and there's a lot of studies around if you can provide housing, and it's not just, we talk about housing in a very kind of polar type of way. There's the houses that, single home dwellings that people own, and we talk about the increased cost for those. And then on the other side of the spectrum, we talk about um, uh, you know camping, park encampments, and things like this, like folks without housing. There aren't just these two kinds. There's all these intermediary kinds of housing where people can be earning different levels of income and they get different levels of supports. But the point is, it's they're being lifted out of the system, and they're being empowered slowly. We need to get those ducks in a row. And it's been talked and talked and talked about by, frankly, our previous mayor, and I imagine the mayor before that, right? Like, this is something that we're always going to have to contend with, but we're not doing anything with. So lots of talk about missing middle. Why isn't that happening yet, right? Lots of talk about building and the relationships with different developers. That should be happening. There's just some things that you look to other countries and other jurisdictions and they move. Toronto, and it's a Canadian thing as well, but we've got this inertia to action. And there needs to be a greater push towards something. We're not going to be able to solve all the things, but we need to choose a couple of projects to move forward on. And that goes so to the federal government, right? What a miss, a tragic miss that they didn't point out Toronto and the ways that they could support it, irrespective of the branding issue that we talked about earlier about Toronto and what the optics of that might be. It There's no reason why they couldn't have presented some solutions or money towards some of these target problems that we're talking about, and have positioned it positioned it well within their ability to do so, but they just neglected that path.
Well, when you consider, and I've said this before, that the map of Toronto, the electoral map of Toronto federally, is all red, and
All
there
red.
was nothing done. Where is Chrystia Freeland? I mean, she is a Toronto MP.
Where are all
Seriously,
of them?
all
Red,
of them.
blue, I don't
Yeah.
care what color you are. Get together and solve the problems. But you're right. It's a streak of red. And this is why, Chrystia Freeland, I believe, is doing really great work, and very important work. Um, we need to get a little bit more grassrootsy in our politics, a little bit more local. And that doesn't mean that's at the expense of Ukraine. That doesn't mean it's at the expense of, the important conversations that still need to happen around China that seem to have disappeared, which, I'm eagerly waiting for them to return. But our urban centers, our economy on the ground level has been something that this federal government has been critiqued, and I believe rightly so. There hasn't been enough transparency or commitments to on the ground practices. I don't want the federal government, doling out however many hundreds of dollars per family for groceries. That's a band-aid solution. Those type of programs are, they earn votes, but they never solve problems. They create problems. And when you accumulate all that money, it's in the billions. Billions solve problems. And that's what I would have liked to have seen from the feds.
I read a piece recently, and it was focused on the Toronto election. But to your point, it was a call for, we need more Rob Ford in government, and it was the Rob Ford that ran for mayor, and it was the idea that they aren't listening to you. That was Rob's clarion call. That's what got him that retail, door-to-door, touch-the-people politics. All kinds of reasons why that all went off the rails, as we know. But the reason he won so easily and handily is because he touched on all of the nerves that you've just exposed.
Yeah, well, look, I'm going to have to go, deal with this offline if I'm all of a sudden an ardent Ford supporter, but maybe I am. Maybe I am.
Call the therapist.
Yeah, that's right. And you know what? And this is my thing. I'm a nonpartisan voter, which confuses the heck of me sometimes. I feel very without a political home right now. A political orphan, I think, is what they call it. And I feel that especially at the federal level. But the Fords, when you look to their style, Doug Ford said something that I thought was so smart a little while ago. He was being contested over something. This must have been mid-COVID, but he kind of said, screw you. I'm not a Tory. I'm not a liberal. Don't put me in one of those buckets. I'm a Ford. And, not many politicians could do that. He's got that unique brand power to do that. But I like that.
Mm-hmm.
I was just kind of like, don't make me play a game that I don't want to play. Don't cast me or position me only in one spot. I dig that. And I think there is great power in that. I think you could be part of a political home, and wave its kind of ethical or moral central ability or purpose, but still challenge it. That's democracy. You've got to challenge these things. And right now, a lot of the politics we're seeing, even at the municipal level right now for our forthcoming election, it shouldn't be political in terms of political stripes, but it is. We're seeing a lot of very obvious, fighting back and forth about traditional political lines rather than hardcore issues.
Yeah, and I was talking to about this to a couple of folks last week, just in terms of getting an assessment. Josh Cole was on the show, and it's interesting to me to see how even the criticisms of some candidates is going into their organization. It's not about what they think. It's not about what they're saying out loud. It's who's in the back room supporting them. That has become an issue in so many respects, and our eye is so far off the ball as a result of all of that. But that's what catches fire on social media, and in fact kind of makes some headlines. I mean, that is what has passed as political reporting over the last couple of weeks in some cases, and I just don't get it. I don't understand the point of any of it. For sure I understand if there's a conflict, etc., but with the limited amount of time, oxygen, and energy we have in the media, can we focus back on what we need to accomplish as opposed to how many Tories are in the back room or liberals are in the back room of whatever campaign?
Yeah, and I mean, politics is political, right? Like all of these campaigns have, boat tons of lobbyists and PR folks, and I'm in that pot too, where we are passionate about certain issues or certain people, so we get involved. But also, if they're the winner, there's an upside, right? Because you have these contacts, and we all play the game. The flip of it is, and the kind of more positive story of this is rarely told, which is there's a lot of really smart people who are political and who are partisan. And they do, really heavy, good political work, and they get stuff done. So, when we're trashing the lobbyist profession or whatever. The flip of it is that they're often the people who are pushing forward the issues that actually matter. There is sometimes a dark side to it, but on the whole, it's not the thing of soap operas that we often see in the shows. It's less sexy often.
Well, and to the point again of the media coverage, it's a way of looking for a wedge and creating it.
Yeah.
I still think that the story in the Star yesterday was interesting about the letter of intent between the City of Toronto and MLSE is vis-a-vis how we were going to run and organize the World Cup of Soccer events here in Toronto. But it spun out of control in terms of messaging right off the bat. And all due respect to anybody who was kind of jumping on that, but Ben Spur did good reporting. And we owe it to him to read it closely and carefully.
Yeah.
Because it got spun out that if the World Cup event loses money, Toronto would be on the hook for it, and MLSE would not have to pay anything. Well, that's not what he reported. He reported that if they lost money in the upgrades, had delays, et cetera, anything that would require an overpayment on the upgrades to the stadium,
Yep.
Toronto would pay for it. Well, Toronto
Yep.
owns that stadium, so of course they're going to pay for it. And why would MLSE have to pay, overage on any of that? Now, they're the project managers. Maybe they should have a little skin in the game, but to suggest that somehow this had turned into a bread not circuses event and we can compare it to, the Olympic Games of Montreal, not on. I didn't get it.
Well, yeah, and I think these, like the last World Cup that was just held in the Middle East, I think it had, and I'll leave it. I can get in the weeds if you want, but it had a lot of negative connotation around it in terms of the who's in power and
Sure.
how it works on the ground. For Toronto, I think the World Cup is a perfect event. We don't have to have a lot of upfront investment like in Olympics,
Exactly.
especially a Summer Olympics where there's, stadiums and all these very niche sports locations required. And I actually think it's going to be a fantastic catalyst for organization and growth along the waterfront. It's going to draw in boatloads of people to Toronto. It's going to help us with our international brand, which we need a little CPR on following, recent events during COVID. So for me, it's it has to be successful. But that's the whole thing, right? Like no one's in this for a failure. Everyone is motivated to make this a good thing. So I'm a fan of the World Cup coming to Toronto. I think it's smart and good business and will be good for us.
Here's the only drawback though. If 2026 rolls around and we're still doing construction around Ontario Place and trying to get it melded in with the exhibition stadium or the exhibition grounds, that's a problem. So back to your point of getting stuff done and seeing how far out it takes to get this stuff done.
But Dave, shame on us, right? Like what we keep talking about those damn red things that we ran through as kids at Ontario Place through the water park. Like if that is our peak vision, why didn't we build that? How long has that thing been sitting still now? Like 20 years ago? Like whatever it is, shame on us for faffing around and not getting anything done. And that's just one example, right? So the World Cup, if we are a quote unquote world-class city, like we've got to get this right and stop messing about, right? And we can, and it will be amazing.
Yeah.
So to your point, we may also mess it up.
Well, but I think it's a catalyst to say, okay, if we're going to get something done, this is not related to World Cup, but we want to be able to show it off when the world comes, because it's going to be right there next to BMO Field.
It's look, we know what the TV will be panning across. The TV is going to be panning across our waterfront, which is already gorgeous. But there's a few hiccups along that panning route that need to be beautified, and we'll get there.
Yeah, well, I just think that to some degree, I am encouraged by the level of interest in quality candidates. There may be an A and a B level in terms of who wants to be the mayor of the city. And I think that's a good thing. On the other hand, I agree with the fact that the bar is probably a little low in terms of who gets to put their name on a ballot. But aside from that, I'm just hopeful, back to your point around the ideas. There's no shortage of ideas. And Brad Bradford, kind of has to stop saying, we've talked too much about it, we need to act. That's all he's done for 3 weeks, is talk and walk backwards. So I think we're going to get impatient with the chat, the talk, at some degree. And that's where we're going to start to make decisions about who's a front runner or whose, ideas are worthy of pursuing. And we hearken back to the election that David Miller won. He was not the front runner. He was not the big name in the race, but an idea pushed him across the line. So, I don't know if it's going to be Ontario Place, if it's going to be housing, if it's going to be something that you can tangibly do on the TTC to make people feel comfortable and confident again to go back onto the subway. But something has to ignite here. Otherwise, this is a wasted opportunity. Yeah,
the narrative has to switch to, this wasn't done, to I'm going to do.
Exactly.
So that combination of ideas and personality, right? Like, I think we're looking for a bit of a player now, someone exciting. I don't know if that personality in the candidates has raised to the surface yet. So, if I was providing counsel to the forerunners, I'd say, get your candidate out there in ways that distinguish them from a personality point of view. So not just the fighter, on the TTC platform, or the person who's saying, let's change things, let's bring the science center. It's who are you as a person, and how am I going to trust you more than previous people or the 43 others that are on the ballot.
Yeah, well, and I was talking to somebody about it, and they're saying, John Tory was something of a unicorn in as much as he is the only one who became mayor in modern times without sitting on council or having a name as a politician at the city level. And that's true, but at the same time, I think he kind of shifted the lens so that we don't automatically assume that the next mayor has to have city council experience.
Yeah, and in some ways, I think, there's great city council candidates. I'm surprised that, and this opens another conversation about like how we draw talent to the pool, but I'm surprised there haven't been more non-political leaders stepping forward, but just not yet, maybe not yet.
Not you.
Not me. No.
Not you. Okay. Lindsay, no. It's always good to talk to you. Thanks for joining us today.
Such a pleasure. I love talking to you.
Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain.
Now and Next is produced by Becky Coles. Our production manager is Jamie Nickerson. Audio editors are Mike Trutler and Drew Garner. And our sonic logo designer is Greg McDonald. Our executive producers are Dave and Aaron Trafford.
This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.